All right, so it's 5:35. Do you want to take it away?
I can certainly do that. I would guess folks are still going to be joining, but good evening for attendees that are here. My name is Carla Ferry. I manage the Northeast Analytics team. I am one of your co-hosts this evening, and with me I have Patrick McHugh from Atlanta, who manages the Southeast and LATAM. Patrick, would you like to say hello or give us a wave?
Buenas tardes y boa tarde. Bienvenidos a todos de Latinoamérica. Muchísimas gracias por su tiempo en esta noche. Espero que pronto yo hablo portugués también. Renato, por favor, traducir a portuguesa. Vamos juntos.
Well done, Patrick. So I would like to welcome all of you to what is the fourth Chief Data Officer Executive Forum that Patrick and I have put on over the last 2 years. We try to pick topics that will help our customers and community think big in terms of their digital transformation to the cloud. And so the goal for this event this evening is to discuss a think big idea that can help drive your journey and success in the cloud. So the outline for this evening is a 90-minute session where the first 45 minutes, we will have a moderated discussion with Bill Franks, our moderator for these events. We're going to spend about 45 minutes going through that discussion. While that is happening, everybody will be muted. So if you do have a question while that 45-minute moderated discussion is going on, the ask is that you just use the chat. It's in the lower right section of your WebEx screen. You can just chat in a question. We will be keeping an eye on that. 45 minutes into the session, Patrick, myself, and Karen will then run 3 different breakout rooms. And in those breakout rooms, we are going to divide the community here to dive a little bit deeper on a couple of data tenant topics. We'll spend about 25 minutes going through some big ideas, some themes around data tenants. We'll then summarize our findings, and right at about 6:45 East Coast time, we'll come back into the group WebEx meeting where we're going to spend the last 15 minutes to share what we learned from our community. One of the key things I like about tonight is that everybody gets a take-home gift. So part of what we're discussing in the breakout rooms, we're going to be capturing some of these ideas in a Google Doc, or excuse me, a Google Deck. So Ramon or somebody out there, if you could just help drop that link in the chat so folks can just make sure they can get into that. Again, 45 minutes into our session, we're all going to jump in that document and make some notes. That's going to be the take-home gift for everybody to capture these big think ideas. So with that, at this point, I'd like to turn it over to our moderator, Bill Franks, who will introduce our panelists.
Yeah, thanks so much and welcome everybody. For those of you who haven't been on yet, I'm Bill Franks. I'm currently with Kennesaw State University outside Atlanta. I'm also the Chief Analytics Officer for the International Institute for Analytics. And I've really enjoyed helping to make these events happen over the last year and a half or two. As Carla pointed out, we're going to have a fun format, I think, today. We'll start with a panel discussion to help set the stage and educate you in terms of what some experts think about the topic of the day to help prime your thoughts for your feedback. And then, you know, one thing about a lot of events is that you come and you hear some good stuff. But what we're going to do, as Carla said, is give you that takeaway and take-home document that'll give you something tangible to not just have for yourself, but possibly share. So the topic of the day is data tenets. And that's a term that may not be one that everyone talks about all the time, but I think it is definitely an important one and one that's rising in popularity. So we're going to go through during the panel helping understand what tenets are. You know, basically, as you've developed a data strategy, you're going to have some foundational principles that help support that strategy. That's the tenets, and we're going to dive into a little bit more about that. Another area we're going to dive into and have a breakout group on is around data products. That's a very fast growing area. Obviously, if you're going to have a data product, you need well cleansed and governed and curated data that can be securely and easily distributed to a variety of stakeholders, even including outside your organization. Obviously, you can't succeed with that if you don't have your own internal house in order. And one of the ways to do that is to make use of your data tenets. And finally, the third topic we're going to touch on is around data literacy as it relates to tenants. So everyone's familiar with the need to help your users and stakeholders be literate in terms of the analytics and data available to them. Another part of that is going to be to help make sure they understand what your tenants are, why they are what they are, and how it impacts what they will and won't have access to over time. So some good information to dive into there, and we'll do that all together. Let's start by setting the stage with a couple of really smart folks who I think are going to have some great commentary for us. First, we've got Doug Laney. He's an Innovation Fellow for Data and Analytics Strategy at West Monroe and had also spent a number of years at Gartner. And maybe, Doug, you want to give a quick extra 30 seconds on yourself?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bill. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you here from Chicago. Honored to be with you all today. So yeah, as Bill said, I'm the Data and Analytics Strategy Innovation Fellow with the digital business and technology consulting firm, West Monroe, where primarily I work with clients to help them conceive and develop new data-driven value streams, or what people call monetizing their data. Again, as Bill mentioned, some of you may know me as a longtime senior analyst with Gartner's Chief Data Officer Research and Advisory Group, and the author where I authored the book Infonomics. I'm also on the faculty of the University of Illinois Business School, where I teach an MBA course on Infonomics, and a faculty with Carnegie Mellon University's acclaimed Chief Data Officer Certificate Program. And recently, I just published the book Data Juice, featuring 101 stories of how organizations are squeezing value from their data. And so if any of you would like a copy of the new book, feel free to reach out to me directly via LinkedIn or my email, which I'll put in the chat here in a moment. So thanks again for having me, and back over to you, Bill.
Yeah, thanks, Doug. And we're also lucky enough to have joining us all the way from England this evening, where it's a little bit later than it is for us, Craig Suckling. He's the head of data strategy for global and strategic industries at AWS to provide an AWS perspective. Craig, a few minutes on yourself.
Thanks, Bill. I'm not going to try and beat Patrick with his multilingual hello. So good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you all. Like Bill said, Craig Suckling, based out of London. I'm part of our AWS data strategy team. I have a focus across all of our EMEA customer base, as well as all of our global strategic customers. And we work across all sorts of different industries, helping CDOs like yourselves to think about how they can drive business value, create customer differentiation with data, analytics and machine learning, and create scalable strategies that really help to transform organizations. I'm an ex-chief data officer. Before joining AWS, I was in industry as a CDO. I've also spent my time creating data-driven startups and being in consultancy in my past. And I'm part of the UK's top 100 in data, featured in 2020 and 2021. It's great to be with you all today.
Great. So hopefully everybody has the feel here. I think we've got a great panel to help dive into this. So let's start with the basics here. You know, what is a data tenant for people who maybe aren't completely familiar with that? And how does it relate to some other concepts that people are familiar with? And I know, for example, Doug, you've written about a concept you call the 18 information principles, and I'm assuming, you know, there's obviously a linkage between data tenants and that as well. So why don't you kick us off?
Sure thing. Thanks, Bill, for mentioning that. Yeah, so when we were first thinking about the concept of data as an actual asset, it occurred to me that, you know, there are ways that other assets are managed, and we'll talk a bit about that. But there's this thing called GAAP, you know, generally accepted accounting principles. And I thought, well, why aren't there a set of generally accepted information principles? So as we started to look around at the way that other assets are managed, there were certain kind of commonalities that kind of came to our attention. And so I published first in Infonomics, and then I'll share a link to the article here on, I think it's on LinkedIn Pulse, this concept of 18 generally accepted information principles. Some of them have to do with the way data is managed and the way data is leveraged, some assumptions about data being an asset, that it should be appraised, that it should be generating benefits, and then there's certain constraints as well. If you're familiar with the way that GAAP is laid out, It's laid out into assumptions, constraints, and then the actual tenets themselves. So I followed the same framework for the 18 generally accepted information principles. And listen, I think there are probably more than 18. These are just the first ones that that we came up with. I actually challenged my students in my MBA class to, in their final exam, to come up with ones that I may have missed, and actually put something on LinkedIn recently inviting others to suggest new ideas. So certainly not the end of the road. I think there are a variety of things that organizations ought to be baking into their data strategies, their data governance, that are just ought to be truisms about data and data management. So we'll be covering them later. I'm going to share the link here in a moment, but yeah, we'll actually be discussing them in some more detail.
Craig, what are your thoughts on how to define a data tenant?
Yeah, sure thing. I mean, to start with a bit of a broader perspective, when you think about tenets, I mean, kind of obvious definition is they represent a principle or a belief. And a good tenet needs to be something that helps your teams to make high quality, high velocity decisions. So think of them as the guardrail principles that enable a wide organization not to have to always refer back to points of decisions, to ask for points of insight to make decisions, but to have these tenets as guides to make really high quality, quick decisions. And they shouldn't be about implementing the data vision. They should, help to think about the ways that you describe getting to that vision, essentially. And so if you think about good data tenets, you need to think about things that will guide your decisions towards that end state that you want to get to in data. Things like, how is data technology going to be built? As a principle, do we want to create loosely coupled, flexible services that come together around data? How's data governed and secured? As a tenet and a principle for data, do we want to create more federation in governance? Do we want to have business accountability? There are other areas you can think about, like how are data priorities determined? How will we focus on identifying what's most valuable to create data assets around firstly? And then you could also think about things like, how is data going to move around the organizations? Are we going to establish tenets around store data once, don't duplicate? Are we going to think about how data transitions and is shared? And so those are some ideas around kind of like some of the other areas that you might think about in building good data practice around. But like I said, it's all about helping to expedite decision-making with key guiding principles that allow you to kind of build an approach towards your vision in the right way, and then set up how data is used across the organization into continuity as well.
Yeah, thank you. That was a good intro. And I'll just point out, I got a reminder that for all of us speaking, that we've got a lot of folks in Latin America. So I want to make a point too. We should all slow down our pace a little bit to help the non-native English speakers. So let's stick with you for a minute, Craig. I think that was a great definition, but people always benefit from getting an example of what does that actually mean. So to the extent you're willing to share a little bit about how has Amazon implemented their own data tenets and followed those principles that you just laid out, I think that would be real beneficial.
Yeah, sure thing. And maybe to kind of like make this a bit more specific. So Amazon.com, the Amazon retail business, they went through a transformation on data back in 2018. They actually moved from on-premise onto AWS. And, as part of AWS, we treat Amazon as any other customer. We have an account team that supports us. They probably give us a harder time than any customer as well. But when they went across that journey, they established some fundamental data tenets to guide them in migrating and modernizing onto cloud for their new data platform and ecosystem. And so some of those things that they thought through were, one, to provide an analytic ecosystem that scales with the Amazon business. This is really important for them because they know and they knew that the Amazon business was scaling rapidly. There was lots of different innovation happening across the business. And they needed to make sure that the analytic ecosystem they built was built in mind to be scalable and to meet with the business as it grew. The second thing that was really important for them was to be able to provide choice and options in analytics technology. For Amazon, they have a very mature community of practitioners across the organization, all operating in tiny, autonomous, cross-functional teams. We typically call them 2 pizza teams because you can feed them with 2 pizzas. You usually get into debates around whether it's a Chicago or a Texan pizza, but I'm not going to go there tonight. But essentially, the idea with that second tenet about providing choice and options was to give those consumer communities the ability to choose what best suited them for their business. And there was a couple of more tenets they also had as part of the transformation. The third one was empowering the business with autonomy and agility and insight. And again, baked into the fact that they saw it to be important to federate out accountability for analytics and insight across the organization, to bake that into how they think about creating the right solutions to serve the business. And then finally, they had a tenet around decentralized governance and avoid bottlenecks across a highly distributed business. And so for them, creating a federated view on how governance is created, pushing that back to the producer community, all those teams that sit close to record of source or to transactional systems, and making them accountable for governance and data quality, was a key principle and tenet that guided how they delivered the new solution on AWS, but also how they organized and stood out accountability across the business. So Bill, hopefully that's helpful, but those are some of the tenets that Amazon has baked in around data, which really helped them with their transformational journey, and they continue to live by that as they operate their data platform across the business.
And just one quick follow-up on that, and you may or may not know the answer to this, but when those tenets were originally developed, was there, an officially assigned small committee that came up with them and then distributed them, or was it more of a process of surveying a variety of stakeholders and getting that feedback and then deriving the tenets from that broad feedback?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was originated from a small group, but they listened and were led by what they were hearing from their customers. And in this instance, their customer was all of the different people across the business who wanted to use data and essentially, take hold of it to drive value for all of their different stakeholders and end customers. And so they listened and heard what was important to that community, having flexibility in choice, autonomy in use, the ability to master and govern their own data. And they used that feedback to inform the tenets they set out to that central team to then drive out the change.
Excellent. So Doug, I know you've obviously worked with a variety of companies in this area. How does what he just described at Amazon match to some of the things you're seeing out in other companies?
Yeah, it's difficult to kind of put a guardrails on what is a tenet versus a policy versus a guideline, and so forth. So I don't, I'm not sure how detailed a tenet ought to be. I try to stick to kind of general truisms about or high level best practices around managing and leveraging data. So that's kind of my perspective on it. So
let's say, an organization decides they'd like to go ahead and start to get their own tenets in place. One of the common questions, obviously, is where do they even start, right? What's a good first step? And as ideas are put forth, whether it's from a survey, whether it's from a conversation, how do you vet which are good ideas to be in a tenant? And to your point, which might be better, not necessarily as a tenant, but just as a policy or as some type of a rule
guideline?
Yeah, exactly. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think it should start from the top. So the chief data officer should be defining, how data is going to be managed and leveraged in the organization. How are we going to, how are we going to treat it? A lot of companies talk about treating data as an asset, but they don't actually apply asset management principles and practices to data. So I think that's a really good first place to start. If you are we're going to talk about data literacy later, but if you're a company that deals with physical assets like a manufacturer or a retailer, then why not apply physical asset management principles and practices and tenets to the way that you're managing your data? If you're a financial services firm, why not apply financial services tenets to the way that you're managing your data? If you're a services organization, why not apply, maybe think about how to adapt human capital management concepts to the way that you're managing your data. And the reason for this is when you do so, not only are you using concepts that are familiar to others, but you're speaking the language of the business itself in managing data. We data professionals have been much to blame for inventing new concepts and terminology and things that really just confuse the heck out of the business. And I think it's really incumbent upon us to start using the language of business in defining the way that we're managing and leveraging and handling and governing data itself.
I think you raised a good point there too, Doug, about there are procedures and processes in other disciplines for doing very similar things conceptually, and why not borrow those? We don't need to totally reinvent the wheel on some of this stuff. And to the extent you can borrow from to your point, the language of your company and your business users, it's only gonna it only makes sense that's gonna help succeed, because now you're speaking their language rather than a foreign language.
There are several chapters in my Infonomics book that deals with that. You know, what can we learn from physical asset management practices like ISO, what's it called, PAS 55, which is an ISO standard. What can we borrow from that about how we deal with things like quality, life cycle, retention, disposal, integration of an asset, and apply that directly to data. And I do the same thing in other areas as well. Even concepts like library science and records management are way out in advance of the principles or tenets that we've ever established for the data management space.
So, Craig, what about you? Any thoughts you have around, good tenant versus bad tenant? What are you focusing on as you're developing these?
Yeah, I mean, first, I love Doug's idea around like marrying the business language, because it just makes it be relatable and easy to understand. And also it kind of connects the business into the fact that data resides and exists to drive value into the business, not the other way around. And so like, I think about like, some of the customers that, I've worked closely with. BMW is one of those. They use data across their manufacturing and their supply chain all the way through to their third-party providers. One of their key tenets is we use data to connect across our value chain. And it's essentially just marrying it back into the fact that they see data as critical to understand how, manufacturing demand drives up fulfillment through their supply chain, and how they need data to help to connect the dots and understand demand patterns through their organization. But you think about just some of the most kind of like basic things around good tenant practice. I spoke earlier about the fact that tenants facilitate rapid, high quality decision making. They should also act as a tiebreaker in decision making. So if there are two different parts of the org that are trying to figure out how best to architect this part of the solution, or how best to think about governing this data, that tenant should act as the tiebreaker to make them make that quick decision. And it needs to be memorable. Again, back to Doug's point, like crisp, catchy business language, avoid jargon, don't allow for a single tenant to speak to two different objectives. Let them be really specific to a singular objective. And tenets evolve as well. It's healthy to always question to see if they're still relevant. We often in Amazon use the phrase until we know better tenets whenever we create tenets, so that's always a final thought to think, let's always be questioning if these are still relevant or if they need to evolve. And then finally, order also matters. So think about putting the most important tenets firstly, and then how they build on each other as you set them out as well. So those are just some of my thoughts just around good practice in creating tenets.
I love your point about the tie-breaking effect and basically having some agreed upon rules for that. It's not, back to our borrowing concept, sounds a lot like when we set up contracts, for example. There's certain principles that are put in that contract so that it's not ambiguous when a situation arises, or even innocent till proven guilty in the criminal justice system, wherein we're arguing over whether something was wrong or not. Well, hey, that's innocent till proven guilty. Go prove it. I think that the tenants are really helping do that same thing. They're giving you this framework through which to judge what's the right direction to go if everybody's up to speed.
And they should be simple to understand, not just for data people, but for business people as well. I mean, just to give you, a few examples. One is one of my principles is the inventory principle. And it sounds sort of obvious, but data should be cataloged, described, classified, related, and tracked. I mean, a lot of companies don't do that. Many companies will, track their. I was with visiting a utility company, and their data strategy said, we want to manage data as an asset. And I read through the whole data strategy document, and there was nothing in there about inventorying their data. Yet when I went to the men's room, the toilet afterward, I see that they have inventory tagged all of their toilets and urinals and sinks. So they're inventorying, these physical assets that are inconsequential to business value. One would argue, but not their data assets, which they claim are key corporate assets. So there's kind of a disconnect there. Another principle would be the ownership principle, that by default, data assets belong to the organization, not to any individual or department or application. Yes, there are going to be exceptions to that, but as a general rule, companies should get into the mindset that data is an enterprise asset, not owned by anybody, and that kind of gets you out of the rabbit hole of data hoarding and data silos. Another one would be what's another one? The replicability principle, which is data should only be duplicated or derived only to improve its utility or availability, and only if doing so increases its net value. So a lot of companies will collect data that they're not using, don't plan to use, and maybe that just increases the cost more so than necessary. And then every time we move or copy data, we're creating a situation where we've increased our attack surface for hackers. We've increased the cost to synchronize that data and the risk to the business that if we don't synchronize the data that we've copied into multiple places, that we're operating inconsistently or making decisions that are inconsistent throughout the business. So these are pretty straightforward and simple principles, definitely ones that can be built upon to create policies and guidelines and procedures from. But I think it's really important to start with tenets, particularly because these are statements that the business can get behind and even help define.
Well, I think this was a good segue, since the term assets come up a couple times in the last few minutes. Let's move on to that concept. And Craig, I guess I would say that if you surveyed 100 people and asked them if Amazon's been effective at using data as an asset, my guess is somewhere in the upper 90s would say yes. And there's always people who will say no to anything, right? But you all have done a real good job building an entire business from the very early days when no one was doing that with data as an asset. So in doing so, how do you see, as you compare to your clients, that Amazon is viewing data differently because it considers it an asset? And what might some of the attendees tonight, for example, be able to learn from your all's approach and philosophy towards that?
Yeah, sure thing. And like you said, it's been a long road and a persistent road in like creating this sustained culture of recognizing the importance of data and the fact that it powers a lot of what we do in the business. And so, you look at some of the outcomes of that by thinking and, and investing in data as an asset and embedding that into the culture of the organization. One of the outcomes we've seen is that there's less effort invested in trying to find and access data, and there's more capacity and time spent on focusing on the customer and what's really valuable to them, and then essentially then using the data to help to drive the right experience. So we're seeing this kind of reversal effect. And, I see many customers struggling and grappling with just trying to get access to good quality data assets. And by having changed and invested in data assets across the organization, that's a lot more less of a friction kind of journey for Amazon. They have access to that, and they can then focus more on the customer. The other thing then is we see data being used throughout the decision-making process here. And so, it's quite common in the Amazon offices, for many of the managers, they would used to have like signs on their door around, in God we trust, all others bring data. And it's a simple statement. It kind of just resonates kind of like around how deep-seated the culture is around data, so that they use it to identify opportunities, to make decisions. We do a lot of document writing in Amazon, and in our documents, it's, really rich in data, because if ever we have an idea that we're trying to kind of proposition and think about as a new thing we should be doing for our customers, we best have the data to back that up. And then when we implement ideas, we use the feedback from data to then iterate and evolve as well. So that kind of like test, learn, iterate, evolve, that really drives innovation at a fast clip, is all as a result of really kind of having a good solid investment in like data asset mindset. I spoke earlier then about like how federating out data is used as well. And so we've seen that by recognizing the fact that assets around data need to be used and consumed across the organization and are the responsibility of everyone. We've seen this effect of, decoupling, decentralizing, where all of the different teams that produce data make that data available for others to consume. And all of those teams that consume data are able to do so independently. You know, I spoke to those two pizza teams earlier, but they access and use data with a specific missionary focus for their business. And they run at a really fast clip, being able to access and use those data assets to innovate for their customers. So those are some of the outcomes we see in Amazon from like having invested in good data asset thinking, you know, all the way through from like prioritizing and focusing on customer to having that great kind of test and learn dynamic, and to then having great autonomy and federation and use of data.
And one just quick follow-up question on that, because I think it's what I'm about to say is probably pretty obviously true, but let's just validate that. You know, one of the other principles I know Amazon has done in the past is having everything be a service, making things reusable, not doing one-off. So I'm assuming you're tying that in, even as you talk about data as an asset, you're not just talking about the raw data elements in their native form, you're also talking about creating various aggregates or various summaries of that data, and those derivations from the raw data themselves are also treated as an asset that's then made available to the organization, right?
Definitely, and we take a real kind of like product mindset to creating those kind of like aggregate data assets as well, which is, you know, they need to be autonomous and be able to be used independently, easily understood by anyone who picks them up, but they also need to be interoperable. So you can start to connect products together. You know, for example, there might be a product around sustainability data, and there might be one around logistics data, and you can connect the two together to understand the impact your logistics cycle has on sustainability and your carbon footprint. So thinking and taking a product mindset towards how you create data assets really helps to create, you know, that broad usage across the organization.
Yeah, so Doug, I think this is interesting. Now we've got, you know, from an asset to a product, and I can easily imagine then, as you start to shift your mindset in these directions, what could have been a good tenant or a good strategy in absence of that, you know, new level of focus, you might have to make some adjustments. So once an organization says, we want to make data an asset, we want to move towards these products that Craig just outlined, how's that going to impact its tenants and its strategy? What are they going to do to adapt?
Well, let me go back to the concept of data as an asset, and just it's a term that or a phrase that we throw around a lot, and as I mentioned, a lot of companies talk about, you know, data is their most important or critical asset, but then they don't treat it like one, and I think they just really haven't internalized that data actually does meet the criteria of an asset. If you look at the criteria of an asset is clearly defined as something that is owned and or controlled, exchangeable for cash, you can exchange it for cash, and that what accountants call it, it generates probable future economic benefits, and is also separable from other assets. And that is the definition of an asset. It's just that the accounting practices haven't come around to acknowledging that reality. But you kind of forget what they say, and kind of get back to Amazon and companies like it. There are three key economic concepts that make data really unique. There's a lot of people talk about data being the new oil, right? And I say, well, that makes sense at a macro level, you know, because it's a driver of the economy today, much like oil was a century ago. But it misses the point that data has its unique attributes. Data is you know, when you consume a drop of oil, you can only consume it one way. You can only consume it once, and then it dissipates. It turns into heat and energy and pollutants. That you can only consume it one way at a time, right? And when you do consume a drop of oil, it doesn't create more oil. So data is very different. Data is what economists would call a non-depleting, okay, doesn't deplete, non-rivalrous, meaning you can use it multiple ways simultaneously, and progenitive asset, meaning whenever we use data, we're typically creating more data. These three tenets are at the core of Amazon's business. So when companies tell me, oh, we could never be like Amazon, you know, they're too big and powerful and wonderful and whatever, I say, just adapt these three core concepts of using data in a non-depleting way. Recognize that it's non-rivalrous. We should be using it in multiple ways simultaneously. Someone, I think who just mentioned this, Carla, mentioned on the chat, using data continuously. And then whenever you do use data, like say the Amazon recommendation engine, and somebody buys something, it creates more data to feed that engine. So those are the things that winning companies are doing today to treat data like an asset. They're also using it to substitute for land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, the classic 4 factors of production. The companies that are thriving today are those that are substituting data for land or inventory, substituting data for labor, substituting data for capital. They're using data in place of money or other resources to spend and buy things. And even in some cases, using data and analytics as a substitute in part for entrepreneurship and innovation and creativity. And one of the things that we found is that companies that behave in this manner, that demonstrate these kinds of this recognition of data's unique qualities, have a market to book value ratio that's nearly 3 times higher than the market average. So you look at companies that have like chief data officers and functioning enterprise data governance functions, and are treating data as an asset. These are companies that are wildly much more successful than others. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but it's kind of my perspective on data as an asset. Why it's so important to go beyond just talking about it as an asset.
Yeah,
I'll say one more thing. If we're going to talk about data as an asset, we need to measure it as an asset. You can't manage what you don't measure well. And I think because many companies don't measure their data as an asset because they're not compelled to by accounting principles, that they're in a poor position to manage it like an asset. And then anything that you're not managing like an asset, you're in a poor position to monetize or generate economic value from. So for many companies, it's kind of a vicious cycle.
Yeah, thanks for that. So I think the insight about the unlike oil or many products that get depleted, the data, you can just keep hitting that same data point again and again. If it has value, not only can it be used for that same value, you might even find additional value points for it later. So it actually has an ability to appreciate over time. Well, I'll tell you what we want to do. We've only got a couple minutes left before we want to get to the breakout. So let's hit the third theme and at least tee it up so that as people go into the breakout rooms, they'll know where it's coming from. And that's around the data literacy point. And I guess, Craig, we'll start with you on this one. As you're going through the data literacy efforts that most companies are doing today already, how do they then go about incorporating the information on the underlying tenants to the audience to help them understand what those tenants are? You described Amazon's. Why are those important for someone who may not come from a data background and isn't very technical? How do you get them to embrace that this is a good thing, that it's going to help them?
Yeah, sure thing, Bill. And so, we covered some of these points a little earlier around using good business language in tenants to relate that to them. And so just, if the question is around clarity in communicating tenants, providing the right kind of like literacy and understanding, using crisp, clear, catchy business language, ensuring that each tenant just captures a single idea rather than covering multiple, allows for like clean decision-making coming out of them as well. But the other thing that's really important about tenants is how you then convey them out to the organization. And there's essentially, both top down and bottom up that's important here. Leadership needs to embrace and live those tenets as well, and needs to show those out to the organization, really communicate them down that these are, the ways that we think about data, why it's important to do it this way. And they become principles for the organization in that regard. But bottom up, as you start to create, different teams that are focusing on data assets in a different way, using those tenets to guide how they build and deliver and operate on data products and assets, they become the evangelizers for the rest of the organization as well. They show how they are living and breathing those tenets and how they're using them to direct their way. And so those are kind of clear, kind of like ways to embed and drive clarity and usage of data tenets and, to your point, literacy techniques on data tenets.
Great. And I guess, Doug, we'll finish with you before we go to the breakouts for a minute or two. What are your thoughts on this one?
A couple things. One is that data literacy obviously is important. If we're going to become a data-driven organization, people need to understand how to handle, how to use data, what it means, et cetera. But it's a lot more than just training. I think it's an ongoing education, an ongoing experiential thing with data. And it ought to be part of change management. So as we're going through digital or data transformations, there needs to be a healthy dose of change management in there as well. We just, for that reason, West Monroe, we just acquired one of the premier change management boutiques, and we're infusing pretty much every kind of product or service or that we're offering with a healthy dose of change management. But they're really, again, like most things data, there are kind of two sides to this coin. There's the analytics side, analytics literacy, like understanding what are use cases and benefits, what are digital products and services, what are the different styles of analytics, how can you think about creating data products or monetizing data, how do you create a data-driven culture, what are key organization structures and skills, and even emerging, helping people understand what are emerging analytic concepts and trends like digital twins and things like that. And then the other side of it is the data side, understanding data as asset or data as property, understanding the unique economic aspects of data, or what I call the Infonomics, what it means for an organization to become data-driven, understanding the value chain for data, where it's created and how it flows, and understanding that chain or that network. What are the variety of sources of data? Understanding that data comes from places beyond your own organization, from web content harvesting, social media, open data sources, partners, suppliers, and so forth. And then you're thinking about data and analytics maturity as a whole. What are the dimensions of maturity, and how do you as an individual, or how does your part of the organization grow and mature in culture, governance, architecture, and so forth. So, and then I think the last thing is executive support for data management. None of this gets done, no matter how literate an organization is, without proper executive support.
Yeah, so I think this is some great tee up. So Carl, I know you're ready to help shepherd people into the rooms. What we're hoping is that all the participants out there will be able to put your thoughts around these topics. And as we mentioned, we'll compile these notes and then distribute them so that you have a good takeaway. So Carla, how would you like everyone to proceed here?
Yeah, thank you, Bill. And thank you, Bill and Doug and Craig, for a thought-provoking 45-minute conversation. Craig, you in particular, there's one thing you said, just like how we use data internally here. We put it a lot in papers. We use it a lot in the meetings that we're in. And Craig, it really hit me, because as I think about like the last 24 months here at Amazon, I've started to use it more because I read about it. I see it. It gets me to want to use it more. And when I look at on a weekly basis, I'm probably using data points in every Slack, email, and meeting that I go to. I wasn't that way 24 months ago. So it's really helped me scale and grow this business. It really was a sharp point. So thank you for that. So here we are. We are at 17 minutes past 6 o'clock. We're going to spend the next 28 minutes in a breakout room. There will be 3 moderators in your breakout room. It will be myself, Patrick McHugh, and Karen. There you are. Thank you, Karen. So Ramon is going to take care of helping all of us find the right breakout room. We don't need to do anything. But here's what I would ask of the participants. When you get in the breakout room, we will take care of unmuting you, so you will be able to speak. I would ask that you come on camera so that we're having a collaborative discussion and we can see one another. And the last thing that I would ask as you go into one of your 3 breakout rooms is lean in and join in, right? We're going to take you through 3 or 4 thought-provoking questions on 3 different topics. So Karen's going to run the breakout room on the role of data tenants. I'm going to run a breakout room on making data an enterprise asset. And Patrick will be running driving data literacy. We're going to have Craig and Doug and Bill float in and out of our rooms. And again, we're going to try to capture some of your ideas. We'll come back and share it at the end. That's going to be our gift to you. So please lean in and join in. Ramon, help us find our rooms.
Everybody's back.
I think we do have everybody back. I was just trying to give a big clap to somebody in my breakout room because we were trying to get him to volunteer to give a summary answer, but he punted it back to Doug. We had a great conversation, Bill Franks. I got to be honest, I'm hoping Doug is going to help us summarize
For sure.
what we figured out here in breakout room 2. But do we want to just go in order? There were 3 different rooms. Patrick or Karen, were you group 1 or 2? Would one of you like to go first and give us a little highlight? Again, we're all going to get a copy of this Google Deck with a lot of good thoughts and notes in it. But Patrick, would you like to go first and try to summarize?
Yeah, I'm happy to. We talked about driving data literacy. We had a couple of questions. One of the more interesting observations was from one of the participants of they want to enable more and more and more usage, and they believe that only about 2% of the data is truly highly sensitive trade secrets, and they want to enable the wider group. But at the same time, that's almost directly in conflict with a lot of information security privileges that says we want to give access to nothing until you prove your need. But guess what? You can't prove the need until you see the data to figure out you have a need. It becomes this interesting circular argument. So it's just different positions. So I found the 2% an interesting tension point in becoming had better data literacy. We talked about maybe segmenting out personas. Is that what part of tenants do we drive to for data literacy, and what do we share? There's certain things we want to share in tenants we share with power users and data scientists and modelers, and we're not. But at the same time, we don't want to overwhelm executives with too much information. So there's certainly parts of tenants we should think about segmenting our personas. And then finally, as always, how do I identify that? The question is, how do we reinforce? And Craig added in a fine point is that we should figure out measurements of our tenants. And if the measurements say it's going well, you reinforce it. If the measurement says it's not being effective, we reform it. We have to change it. So data about data inherently helps drive this reinforcement of tenants. So that's our summary. Next.
That's great. Doug, what do you think about going next?
Yeah, sure. So we talked about making data, the concept of making data an enterprise asset. And the first question we addressed was, what does it actually mean to treat data as an asset? And so we talked about things like measuring it, understanding its quality at different points along its life cycle, taking a life cycle approach to data much the same way we do with other kinds of products. We talked about the data really needs how data is actually used for business decisions, and that we talked a bit about culture as well, and that the data needs to be kind of at the core of every decision and driving product decisions in the organization and product features. Then we discussed whether whether data was treated in our organization, why or why not. Some people said, yes, it's treated as an asset to drive decisions and run the business. Others said, well, yeah, but we don't measure it like an asset, and we do generate value from it, but we kind of stop short at measuring the value that it contributes. We had a little bit of a debate as to whether data should be depreciated or not if we are to value it. And somebody mentioned that they still have a long road to make it kind of the main driver of all decisions. And at that point, they'll probably feel like data is really being treated or at least leveraged as an asset. We talked a bit about tenets as well and what tenets need to change or to really enable data as an asset. We talked about taking your data. You might take your data related policies, things that are really more kind of detailed, and boiling them up a level to make them much more consumable and understandable by the business, ensuring that we recognize data's unique qualities as an asset. Yes, it is an asset, but it has these unique qualities, and that what else we talk about? The having a outcome or product orientation to what we're doing with data rather than just the kind of the standard one source of truth concept. And that we need to appreciate that data means different things to different teams as well, and that we require some accountability. And then finally, we talked about principles that ought to be considered and which ones should be less important, perhaps. We discussed how the concept of a hub and spoke data architecture might be something that needs to be revisited. We argue that maybe data products should be defined by data consumers, not by the producers of data, because typically when you're creating a data product, it's involving multiple data sources. So to rely on all of those source producers to get together to define a product that you as a consumer need is really kind of nonsensical. And unfortunately, this is one of the common concepts that we think that data mesh really gets wrong. But yes, companies need to think about when to apply a data mesh or fabric kind of concept to data versus a traditional hub and spoke. We think there ought to be metrics to drive data quality, that it's difficult to do data quality without sufficient metrics being generated and reported, and that the concept of data owners, maybe we should revisit that, and instead of assigning data owners during in data governance programs, we should define maybe trustees or fiduciaries, people who are ethically and legally bound for the well-being and safekeeping of an asset, but aren't actual owners, because we want to discourage data hoarding and silos if we're really going to treat data as an asset. So we covered a lot of bases.
Yeah, that was great. It was a good summary. There was one other fun little conversation that we had, because we had somebody from an insurance organization with us, and you posed the question, should we be insuring data?
Right.
And that was a thought-provoking question in our breakout room for sure. But thanks, Doug, for the good summary. And so last but not least, we've got Karen in breakout room 3, I believe it is. Would you like to provide a summary?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we talked about really, what a tenant is, and what counts as a data tenant. That was really the first question. And, to drive the vision for data in the organization, something that's not a policy or a rule, but really empowers people to make a decision. I think that was something that was consistent in what was listed on that slide. And again, pushing that down to individuals that can act on a daily basis, as well as leaders, to make those agile and fast decisions. So we're accelerating the data strategy on those two-way door decisions that can easily be made without creating a lot of friction. I think one of the things that came out on the boards that was really important too, when we asked, who has tenants today and can they talk about the process that they went through, David Mayo talked about how when he came into the role with his organization, they had a set of tenants or principles, but they were created kind of within a silo within the IT/data team, and the business was not included in that. There was no input from them, and so how important that is to creating that relationship with the business, and then of course revisiting that, 6 months, a year, to constantly ensure that those tenants are aligned with the business strategy and the data strategy together in tandem. And then, talking as well about the business and data strategy, making sure that, in fact, I think it was Srini that said they have quarterly meetings where they're just constantly revisiting what is our business strategy, what are our business objectives, is our data strategy aligned with that, and then as part of it, they take a look at the tenants and make sure everything's still aligned there as well. And then we had one person who talked about the big blocker to them having tenants right now is just getting the concept out there, Doug Laney, that data is an asset, and that there should be data products, and there should be resources to support that as a revenue generating mechanism. So I thought that was very interesting that, just coalescing around data as an asset is a blocker to being able to develop the tenants themselves. So that's a quick summary of what we came up with.
Fantastic. Very thought-provoking. And Karen, fantastic audio on your headset. So whatever you paid for that, it was well worth it. Sounded fantastic. This has been a great, 85 minutes with all of you. I hope we've provided a few new ideas, something to think about. I hope we've provided some think big ideas around data tenants and your data strategy. Bill Franks, as always, thank you for moderating our fourth Chief Data Officer Executive. Yeah. Before folks go, 2 quick things, right? Because we did have Doug Laney join us, and he's been kind enough as a distinguished author to offer everybody a copy of his book. And If you just take a look in the lower right corner where the chat is, we're just asking for one quick thing. One, if you could fill out the survey link. We really do value your feedback. We use it to help us select, hey, what should be the next topic that we bring to you? Who should be the next speakers that we invite to this private panel? So we really do appreciate your feedback in the survey. And second, by filling that out, again, distinguished author Doug has offered to share a copy of his book with everybody. So with that, Patrick, any closing comments?
Yeah, again, great session, thought-provoking. Doug, what is the third? We heard non-depleting, non-rivalrous, and no one could remember the third. You're on mute.
The third is progenitive. Using data to raise
Progenitive.
data.
Progenitive, right? So that was fascinating about how data is this non-depleting, non-rivalrous progenitive. I love the provocative statement of, what if it was an asset on the balance sheet? I love the insurance question, risk of loss. If there's a risk of loss, should it be insured? Great question.
There's a whole story behind that. After 9/11, the insurance industry realized it was exposed because companies tried to submit claims for the value of their data that they lost in the Twin Towers, and the insurance companies denied the claims, suggesting that data wasn't a property and therefore wasn't covered. But the policies were unclear, so the insurance industry updated the commercial general liability policy template to explicitly exclude data from P&C policies. They did that a month after 9/11.
Wow. And another story in closing, I know we're at time, is about Ukraine. Ukraine changed their laws literally overnight. They wanted to keep all their data in country, and literally the night before the invasion, they changed their laws, moved all their data to the cloud, just to say how important it is to the inherent well-being of a country. So thank you everyone for that. As Carla pointed out, we're going to be sending out a survey. We'd love feedback, and we'd love your thoughts on what the next session should be. We want to make this community keep driving collaboration. And two final other requests or ideas. First, we hope to see you at our reInvent user conference, either in person or virtually. That is the last week of November, I think it is. There's some great announcements and learnings from other customers at those events. There's always great sessions, so we hope to see you there. We'd also love to host you for a data executive briefing in our Seattle facility to hear your vision for how you're going to transform via data and what we can do to help. So that offers to everyone. Love to host you in Seattle soon, and hope to see you at reInvent either in person or virtually. So thank you everyone for the time. Muchísimas gracias por su tiempo en esta noche. Hasta luego. Take care. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao, ciao.
All right.
Thank you.
Jamie.